Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's episode 22 of The Pick List. Tell me what you've been up to this week.
Hello Laura. Yes, I've been doing quite a bit of online training again, running some virtual courses and workshops on writing skills and opinion writing in particular. What have you been up to?
I've been up to Global Meat Alliance this week. We've got a new website, globalmeatalliance.org. So anyone in the meat world that wants to have a nosy at that, please do. So really excited to have that launched. We've got a fantastic show this week as well, haven't we?
We have, and we're joined by Rod Addy. Rod is editor of Food Manufacture magazine, a major trade publication covering food manufacturing, as you would imagine from the title. He's got a really great perspective on what's happening within the food industry and brought some really interesting articles for us to discuss as well.
Shall we start the show?
Rod, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Why don't you briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners what you do and how you're connected to the food industry?
So my name is Rod Addy and I'm editor of a trade publication called Food Manufacture, which covers food and drink processing, every category of food and drink across the UK. Yeah.
Fantastic. And you've brought some really interesting, quite colourful articles for us to discuss as well. So we're really excited to talk to you about those. Why don't you tell us about the first article you've picked for us?
So the first one has appeared in a few publications, but I picked up on the Manchester Evening News a couple of days ago. Was on Burger King asking people to eat at McDonald's during lockdown. And I think there are several sort of interesting things about this, really. I mean, first of all, with my cynical hat on, what a great element, what a great approach to PR to actually come out and encourage customers to eat a potential rival, really kind of winning over the moral high ground there, I think, in kind of PR terms. So stroke of genius and cutting totally against the competitive mindset, I guess, that's out there a lot of times in the industry. So that's the first thing that I was thinking. The second thing that I thought, and maybe kind of leaving to a certain extent leaving the cynical hat to one side. I mean, clearly a sign of the times. That we have now a situation where we're going into a second lockdown in England, and everybody needs to support everybody else through it. Really, we all need to kind of pull together, and I think at this stage, there is a sense in which a lot of the traditional views around competition and non-collaboration are having to be put on one side. That said, if you look a little bit deeper, and of course I can't confirm or deny this, but certainly if you look at the suppliers of both Burger King and McDonald's, they have a lot of suppliers in common, and the message is going out, I think, also beyond the UK as far as this is concerned. And again, I think that's an even bigger signifier of exactly what's at stake here, because this is the story of the suppliers behind these outlets who are also finding it pretty tough, even the bigger players, in terms of the impact on sales that they are suffering, certainly on the food service side.
What do you think the message these suppliers are taking from a campaign like that?
Well, I think on the one hand, the message is very supportive, because clearly if they're supplying both outlets, that there's a sense in which actually this is all filtering back to you, and we are supporting you as your customer, really. I mean, obviously it's not putting those terms to the consumer because the consumer isn't aware of all these aspects, but certainly, from the supplier perspective as well, I think it shows a certain amount of of support, really, and a desire to kind of to show a sense of solidarity.
Yeah, totally. And I thought I really liked, or what I really liked about this campaign, and the article that sort of explains some of the rationale behind the campaign as well, is, as you said, that spirit of collaboration, that sense that these are such extraordinary times, and particularly that out-of-home sector obviously being hit incredibly hard by this second lockdown in England, that you do need the supply chain to come together. We did hear a lot of that during the first lockdown, didn't we? Is your sense from what you're seeing in the industry, are people, is that spirit of collaboration still there? Are people going into that second lockdown with the same intentions, or is there a little bit of fatigue that's set in as well?
Well, I think, of course, there's fatigue, because I think there's fatigue in the general populace as well at this point. It is really becoming a long, slow grind now. But I think, if anything, the urge to work together is even greater than it was before, because what's at stake is even greater. The pressure is increasing all the time, and we're at a stage in the year where, as a few people have said, it's the perfect storm. We've got Christmas coming up. We then go into the end of the Brexit transition period, and there's so much uncertainty around the Brexit transition period, but also to a certain extent around Christmas, because we've never approached the Christmas like this before. We've never approached the Christmas in the build-up, where shopping trends are so unpredictable, and so there is a huge amount of uncertainty, and again, such a hit on the food service and the hospitality side, that that sense of pressure really requires people to work together. And behind the scenes, that there are there obviously been groups that have been formed of a lot of the top suppliers and bosses of the top suppliers working with government to try and respond as soon as they know more about the situation. I mean, that of course brings in the area of how much the government can help, given the state of things, particularly with regard to Brexit at the moment. But at least there is, I think, an intense move around top suppliers, top competing suppliers, to share information and to support as much as possible where they can know anything at all.
I think you're totally right, Rod, and that whole we're in it together and supportive industry we've seen more and more over the last few months. And I love the fact that you picked this article, because a couple of days ago when it was the advert was released, you just had to open LinkedIn and it was almost every single post on LinkedIn. So the amount of social media coverage it's had, both to consumers and trades, been phenomenal. And what it's triggered in my mind, it's a bit like the tone of voice that KFC had, wasn't it, when they had logistical problems getting chicken to their restaurants. That someone somewhere has had that brave agency conversation of, right, we want to have this advert, what do you think? And someone's made that call, and maybe the pace that they made that call. Just looking at the McDonald's social feeds this afternoon, I can't see a response yet from them. And the likes of Greg's and others, albeit smaller businesses, are pacier with social media and having that banter about, with Piers Morgan about vegan sausage rolls or whatever it may be. And I think that's where McDonald's has an opportunity to step in and marry that tone of voice. But invariably, as we know, a huge multinational like that, it'll have gone up the chain, it'll have gone into several agencies, and there'll be a lot of conversations deciding what exactly we're going to say.
Absolutely.
Brave of Burger King, and I like it. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out over the next couple of days, and if others do jump in and try and look as supportive to the outside world.
Yeah, and indeed how it influences other campaigns going forward. Maybe it'll be a breath of fresh air that will lead to other similar campaigns.
Yeah. Julia, what's your first article this week?
So, my first pick this week is an article called The Secret Life of Shopping Lists, and it was published on LinkedIn by Brian Roberts. If you are in grocery retail, you will probably know Brian. He was an analyst at Kantar for several years and then worked at TCC Global, the loyalty company. At the start of 2020, Brian lost his job, and when the pandemic hit soon after, and the supermarkets were recruiting like crazy and looking for staff to help feed the nation, he, like many others, decided to take a job at a local supermarket, in his case, Tesco. And so he's been working in various shop floor roles since and sharing what he's observed and learned about shopper behaviour from the ground during that period on his social media. And of course, because he has that background as a retail analyst, the perspective he's able to bring to that is absolutely fascinating. It's rare for someone to be able to combine shop floor experience with strategic insight. He also happens to be a very good writer. I commissioned him several times when I was at the grocer. I always felt he was great at spotting interesting angles and write in a way that's really engaging. So this particular piece that he's written on LinkedIn revolves around shopping lists. While on trolley duty at Tesco, Brian has been spotting all sorts of shopping lists that have been left behind in those trolleys, and he basically started taking photos of them and posted them on Twitter. To date, he's collected about 80 of them, and so he decided to write a longer piece about those lists, looking at patterns and trends and just raising some interesting questions about what these shopping lists reveal about how we shop. So what did he find? Well, some really interesting stuff generally around how people write their lists and what they write them on. Some of the examples are fairly exotic. Kitchen towel, old bills, sheet music, all feature in his collection. There's some really interesting variety in how people structure their shopping lists. So some will just list items randomly. Others group them together by category, others in the order that they are clearly merchandised in store. He also found a really interesting mix of sort of very specific items, such as, green peppers or baked beans, but then also some more general reminders, things like dinner for Tuesday or snacks for the kids, which indicate that, there's a lot of scope there still for spontaneous decisions to be made in store, even if you are using a shopping list. The final thing that I wanted to pull out of the piece that I thought was particularly interesting was the lack of brands that Brian talks about. The overwhelming majority of the items on these shopping lists are listed generically, not by brand name, even in categories where there's a big brand leader. So you will see typically mayonnaise and ketchup, not Hellmann's and Heinz on these shopping lists. Where brands are mentioned, they tend to be reasonably niche items. So he found some specific brand mentions around denture adhesives, for instance, or indigestion relief, things like that. There's every chance, of course, and Brian points that out in his article, that the consumer still ends up buying those big brands, even though they're just using generic terms in their shopping lists. But he still thinks it's something that you'd probably be a little bit concerned about as a brand marketer, that lack of specific brands on those lists. But all in all, I thought just a fantastic article that's really worth reading, not least because it will make you look at your own shopping lists and your own shopping habits in a new light. What did you make of it? And tell us about your own shopping list habits.
Yes, well, first of all, I'm a fairly traditional shopper. I think there's some evidence, indeed, I think it's included in that article, that there's some evidence that people have become more traditional since coronavirus set in and lockdown set in some ways, that there's a big weekly shop that they do. It used to be the case where this was sort of broken up over the week and people would sort of have 2 or 3 different visits, maybe to multiple outlets. But now I think there is a return, seemingly, to to a traditional kind of big shop, and a lot of people I think are still doing that in at a physical outlet rather than online. Partly, I think, because of the initial problems that a lot of people encountered in terms of online availability. So yeah, a lot of people are doing traditional weekly shops. I'm certainly one of them. I go to Tesco. I don't mind declaring my hand as far as that's concerned. There's a big Tesco just down the road from me, and I have to say that I write out on a piece of paper that shopping list, and I will use a number of different kind of bits of paper to do it, really. So yeah, I recognise a lot of the paper that was described in the article. So envelopes, backs of envelopes. Sometimes there'll be drawings that my 3-year-old has done, and I'll take a piece of paper and write on the back of one of those. Even shop receipts, if they're blank on the other side, I'll write on them and use them as a shopping list. I mean, I guess partly it's a sort of subconscious way of trying to avoid waste, but trying to make as much use out of possible out of what I've got. And I tend to group by, because I'm a regular visitor to that Tesco. I tend to group by the layout of the store. So I have the layout of the store in mind in my head, so I can completely identify with those people who, when there's a store makeover and the layout is changed, suddenly they're all at sea. They don't know where they are. And I suspect if there is, if and when that happens, at my big Tesco store, I shall be wandering aimlessly along the aisles trying to make sense of my list in relation to the order.
Laura, when you looked at this piece with your marketeer's hat on, how worried do you think brand marketers should be about the fact that most of these shopping lists use generic descriptors rather than brand specific items?
Yeah, when I've read the article twice because I thought it was a fantastic article, and it was probably something I wouldn't have come across normally. So thank you so much for bringing it to the show. I think if that list is for yourself and you're not giving it to a partner or a family member to go off and do that shop, you're probably defaulted in your mind knowing what your brand preference is. So maybe that is just shorthand. And I know it says in the article ketchup, but maybe that is shorthanded for people that is Heinz and they would know that. But if that's list going to someone else, then yeah, that needs to have the brand on, because there's always the danger the wrong thing may come back. I think I was really intrigued by the article as well, that it reminded the fact of meal repertoire, and I know he quotes around five dishes that we generally cook, and we just rotate around those. And I know research says up to 6 or 7, but what the opportunity is and what we're seeing on those lists is Saturday night tea and tea for Tuesday, that actually there is an opportunity still to try and shake up what that meal repertoire may be and get something different in there. I think looking at those lists, it shows that consumers are still wanting that inspiration. They are still wanting something different. The challenge is, as we've spoken about before over the last few months, is shoppers are feeling like they're running the gauntlet of retail and don't want to spend the time on a gondola end thinking, oh, this is a different stir fry with a different flavouring that I might be interested in. And if nothing else, maybe that repertoire is even rationalising at the moment because people just want to get in and out at pace. But it gives me hope, and I think if I was a brand manager, I would be a little bit worried, but I would be over the optimist, thinking it's just a shorthand. They know they need to pick up Heinz.
Laura, what's your first pick for us this week?
My first pick is from BBC Online, and it's Walmart drops inventory robots from its stores. And I picked this because I thought it was a really nice look behind the scenes in terms of what they were trying to achieve with some automation. So for the last 3 years, since 2017, Walmart have had a partnership with a company called Bossa Nova Robotics, and they've been supplying around 500 robots into their stores. And these robots scan shelves to ensure all the stock and the price is accurate. And one of the reasons for this, obviously particularly in the US, they're doing a lot more curbside collection, and they need to know exactly what is in that store because they're not ordering from a big central distribution unit. And they've taken them out of stores because they're going to use people instead. And basically the shorthand, which it doesn't say exactly in the article, but reading between the lines, is it's not working as well as maybe people can in terms of checking that inventory and checking the prices. It points out in the article that robots are still in store in some ways, but not in terms of inventory checking, in terms of floor scrubbers. Again, another topic that we've previously picked up on the pick list. And then it gives the reflection back to Amazon and Alibaba, And unsurprisingly, as we know, they're using a huge amount of robotics, but they're in a different setting, aren't they? They're in huge warehouses. And in 2012, Amazon bought a robotics company, and now it has almost 250,000 robots in its warehouses. It also talks in the article about Target and the fact that they're obviously a bricks and mortar operator and they're relying on people still rather than robots. And it just got me thinking, really, if you are in retail and you are in that grocery setting, do you want to be coming up to a robot in a store, or are they just running overnight? Or how can these big retailers that are doing more and more online make sure that they're checking that inventory and picking things correctly when they're having to rely on people? What do you see, Rod, particularly in the manufacturing sector? Are you seeing more automation and robotics coming in? And what's the grocery sector doing off the back of that?
Well, I mean, it's a very, very interesting topic. For years, people have talked about automation and robotics. But I think in reality, unless you're talking about the really big players, the majority of food and drink manufacturers only have tended to focus on automation at either the sort of beginning or ends of lines. So things like palletizers, when the product has been made and it starts actually being put on a pallet and being wrapped up ready for delivery, and that sort of thing. So, but beyond that, automation was a lot more limited than I think a lot of people would have liked. But of late, we are seeing, I think, quite an increase in the level of interest around automation for all kinds of reasons, partly actually because of the availability of people on the ground. So we're going into a period now where we've got the immigration bill obviously going through, and there are certain restrictions on the workforce in 2021 from outside the UK. Traditionally, food and drink manufacturing has relied quite heavily on migrant workers, particularly from Eastern European countries, on the production side of things. And that's becoming a lot harder to do now for a variety of reasons, partly because of the ceiling or the lower limit rather of what's required in terms of wages from people that you'd be recruiting that would be actually looking to live and work in the UK. But I think also partly because people are seeing other opportunities elsewhere. There's a whole bunch of reasons for it. And so automation is seen as a kind of a way of, being able to perhaps reduce the amount of workers in that area and increase them on the more skilled side. But of course, in introducing automation, you then bring in the issue that you need workers that are fairly skilled, that are going to have to deal with the kind of technology that you will then have to deal with as automation increases. So I think that shifts the skills challenge away from just the kind of the lower production line and maybe the mid-tier roles, like the operations and the technical roles, looking at production and processing, and towards much more kind of high-tech use of software, manufacturing execution systems, and all that side of things. And that will be one of the challenges going forward, is availability of people that will be skilled in those areas, I think. But yeah, I've seen a distinct increase in terms of not just interest, but in terms of people actually investing in equipment that also, let's be frank, will make things more efficient and actually will cut costs to a certain extent as well, provided they're managed correctly, of course. And that's the other thing.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting piece, and two things that stood out to me, or that I took from the article. On the one hand, I think is the fact that when we talk about automation and the potential it has for making certain operations much more efficient, is that of course it's not a silver bullet. And this is one of those examples where you have a big company trying out automation, deploying some of these robots, and then after several months realizing that actually these automation works really well in this particular part of our operations and it doesn't quite deliver in other parts. I think the story was originally reported first in the Wall Street Journal, and it's worth having a look at the Wall Street Journal piece, because there's a little bit more in there around some of the ROI challenges that they were potentially looking at. The other thing that sort of stands out to me is that I think as you have more grocery retailers, more food manufacturers experimenting with this kind of technology, so there is that sort of test and learn mindset that you need to have. And I think sometimes that can be quite challenging in an industry that's perhaps not as used to having to deal with these sort of quite tricky technology decisions, where the reality is that you are going to try out quite a few things, and then some of them will stand the test of time and will work out, and others you basically go, well, that was an interesting pilot and we learned a lot, but ultimately we didn't decide to progress with that. So I think that's sometimes that can be quite challenging, I think, internally, but also from a corporate comms point of view, that you're having to sort of manage the excitement of the of the initial story that, you know, you're doing a cool thing with robots, but then you're also having to sort of tell the story of how you're moving on from a particular test and trying out something else. Rod, what's your second pick for us?
This is kind of a light-hearted piece from The Guardian, looking at cocktails and a kind of a different take on the what are your favorite cocktails? So it's 5 classic American cocktails to drink your way through election day, obviously referring to the presidential election that's votes are still being counted for in the US as we speak. I just think, wow, where to start really? But without getting too much, I think kind of getting drawn into the politics of it. I just thought it was a great way to kind of present a really kind of tongue-in-cheek way to present several different cocktails. I love the cocktails consumed depending on the on how the voting and on how the voting pans out. So if Biden wins in a landslide, then it's a pina colada. Then if you've got Trump snatches a quick victory, they've got a drink called the Four Horsemen, which I have to say I wasn't familiar with. I hadn't come across before, but now I have. So that was a good one. And then in the unlikely event of a tie, the hurricane as well. And everything that can go wrong does go wrong with the Long Island iced tea. And it made me think, actually, on the wider level, whenever I read articles like this, it always makes me think cocktails are quite iconic, aren't they? They, in terms of the memory, they sort of can often take you back to a certain time and place. And so whenever I read these sort of articles, I'm reminded when I read about a certain cocktail, it kind of makes me think, oh yeah, I remember, summer in, I don't know, the Canary Islands. That gives you some indication of where my holiday habits were in the early days of my holidaying, or somewhere like that. It's and there's a whole kind of host of kind of experiences and memories that come along with that. So just thought it was quite a fun article.
I loved it. I thought you were going to say holidaying in Monaco or something like that, Rod. I was listening to what you were going to say.
My tastes have never been that rich, I do have to say.
I've just written down on my notepad Long Island iced tea. Anything that could go wrong does go wrong, because I think that's probably where we are at the moment at time of recording.
Yes. Yes, it's very close, isn't it? It was very at the time of this recording. It was very, very close, and of course, by the time this goes out, we may well know. But it's extraordinary times, really. I just think that again, this made me think. I've never really been on tenterhooks for the results of a US election in quite the way that I have this time round. I mean, this is the level of interest that I would have shown in an election for the leading party in the UK usually. So again, it just shows how things have changed really in terms of politics, in terms of communication over the last few years.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's so interesting also just how often food and drink plays such a big role in these sort of pivotal events. I mean, I have to say I did stay out for the election goes. I do like a good election. I did not drink cocktails. That's clearly where I went wrong. I would have quite fancied a pina colada in particular, not just because of the clear Biden victory that it represents. I do also quite like a pina colada. But it's interesting when you had a look at, various various journalists, commentators, people staying up to watch the election. On Twitter, lots of people were kind of tweeting pictures of their special election snacks. I think that quite a lot of thought had gone into that. And I think, yes, there's a sort of great playfulness around this. And this article, I think, is really great. It's really nicely written as well. There's some fantastic colour in there. But it also, I think, once again, you have these sort of pivotal moments and you see people turn to their favorite kind of comfort food and drink to either celebrate these moments or just get them through those moments. And we're recording this on the eve of the second lockdown in England, and we're about to talk about that a little bit later with one of your picks, Laura, as well. I think that sense of comfort and self-care and wellness that's sort of tied in with food and drink is so important at the moment.
Julia, what's your second pick this week?
So my second pick this week is from Sifted, and it's an article titled "Reinforcing Food Waste or Fighting It." The article basically looks at the growing number of food waste startups and some interesting tension that started to appear in that sector. In particular, the founder of a food waste app called Karma has spoken out to say he wants to see more transparency and scrutiny of startups operating in this space. He worries there's a perception that just because you're a startup doing something about food waste, everything you do is automatically great. And he believes that isn't the case, and there should be much more scrutiny around various strategies and approaches and business models involved in these startups and apps. And the tensions that he is talking about, or some of the potential controversy, is around a particular type of startup that connects consumers with restaurants and retailers, typically through an app, so the consumers can basically save food that would otherwise go to waste by buying it at a massive discount. That is in fact what Karma does as well, but there are also other apps in the market such as Too Good To Go, Rescue and Your Local. And they're becoming very popular indeed. And the problem the team at Karma is worrying about is that these apps are such a great route to market for some restaurants and retailers now. They're so good at getting rid of any food waste that people in these businesses don't have any incentive to waste less. They don't have to plan more carefully. They don't have to do better forecasting. They just carry on as they've always done. And if there's surplus at the end of the day, they just get rid of it using this super convenient app. And so the question he is asking the guy who runs Karma is essentially, are these food waste apps really challenging the status quo on food waste here, or are they actually enabling problematic behavior? Are they enabling waste? And I thought it was such an interesting question to raise. And it's particularly interesting to see how different startups in this space are responding to that challenge. There are quite a few startups quoted in this particular article. And, Karma obviously want to increasingly use their app and their technology to help businesses with demand forecasting. So they want to see businesses registered with their platforms sell less and less surplus food as time goes on. But then they also speak to people such as Too Good To Go, and they are basically saying, well, we're not actively looking for businesses to be selling less, but that it's often a side effect of using the app. And they also say that any companies that use their platform just as a marketing tool or as a route to market, rather than as a way to reduce food waste, will also be kicked off the platform. So it's clearly an issue that's sort of starting to rise up the agenda within that startup community. It's still sort of reading the article leaves you feeling like there's quite a lot still to be resolved here in terms of which model ultimately is going to be most effective at reducing waste. What I found encouraging, though, was the fact that these kinds of conversations and debates are taking place, because it shows that I think the debate on food waste is maturing, that we as consumers, but also as commentators and as businesses, are becoming more demanding of anyone who's working in this area, that we're not just saying, well, just because you're doing anything around food waste, it's great, but that we're starting to ask some more probing questions. And Rod, I thought it'd be so interesting to hear your perspective on this because, of course, food waste reduction is a huge priority for so many manufacturers now. And some of these startups, I think, have done a fantastic job of really enabling these manufacturers to do something about food waste. Are you sensing that that debate about food waste is becoming more sophisticated within manufacturers as well? Are they looking at different models in a slightly more differentiated way?
Yes, I think so. I think it'd be interesting to see how the consumer side does kind of drive the rest of the side back up the chain. Um, I Certainly food waste is a huge issue for food manufacturers. Whatever the perceptions are, and um, and they are. It is one of their key metrics. One of the key metrics that the big manufacturers will use in terms of how they deal with waste. And most people clearly have a zero waste to landfill approach now. But then, once you kind of drill down beyond that, there are various things that you can do, and depending on the manufacturer you are, some waste can be used for obviously animal feed. If it's particularly if it's deemed not fit for human consumption, but certainly fit for animal consumption. So there's that route. There's also the route that we've seen quite a lot over the last few months, which is, once that product goes out to retail and it's not sold, then you've got a bunch of charities that work in terms of getting that product out to people that in need, people who are vulnerable. So Fair Share, for example, has done tremendous work over the last few months in that area. In terms of getting product out to people who have hit hard times or are in difficult situations for one reason or another. And one of the interesting things there actually is it then made me think, well, okay, so on the one hand, you've got food manufacturers who are actually trying to drive down waste. And the reason they're trying to drive down waste overall is because it's a key efficiency metric. Clearly, you want to do as much as possible with the raw material that you have. And if you can rework that raw material into more product, then there's no need for waste. Whereas if you do waste, then you're losing out to a certain extent commercially in sales terms. But then the more you go down that line, what then happens to the people who are currently being fed at the other end of the chain by the likes of Fair Share and other charities? What happens if the chain gets so lean that there won't be this product there to go to food banks, to go to Fair Share and other charities? What happens to the people who are still going to be struggling just as much? And that's an interesting challenge as well, I think, socially.
And it's interesting how much more and more there's press about food waste, isn't there? And I guess the whole food poverty issues that we've had on the front pages of the papers over the last couple of months in particular is making this area more and more acute. And as you say, Rod, for these manufacturers, it's a key metric for them, along with packaging as well, and plastic usage and all the rest of it. And I think it's interesting that some of these big processors, as we've seen, and manufacturers have dedicated teams now looking at this, whereas 10 years ago that wouldn't have really even existed. So yeah, and I was really interested by these companies and these startups that are working in this space. But it's so interesting that actually, if we're making it too easy, then will manufacturers actually waste less in the first place.
Laura, what's your second pick for us?
My second article this week is from The Guardian, and it's chocolate sales soar as UK shoppers comfort eat at home amid COVID. And no surprise here, chocolate got my attention instantly. Anything with gin or chocolate in the headline, I'm normally bringing it to the pick list. So I was really intrigued by this, and annual spend on chocolate is 50 million up year to date. And that's only about 3%. But what's really interesting is what we're actually buying. buying. So unsurprisingly, smaller bars that you'd probably be picking up at a convenience store or food to go is seeing a decline, but sharing bars and multi-packs are significantly increasing. And what that's actually resulting in is, as a population, we're eating more chocolate. Multi-packs specifically are up 20%, and large chocolate blocks are up 46%. And it's all around this self-treating at home. And I really like the phrase that analysts use in the article about the lipstick effect, and it's cheap treats sell well, particularly in hard economic times, to make us feel good. And there's a nice little quote from Jane Goodison from Waitrose, the confectionery buyer, and she says she's seeing an increase in premium chocolate sales as these little treats can uplift spirits, particularly in times of COVID. In the article as well, it gave a nice sneak peek into Hotel Chocolat, who you would think actually have they done really well, but unsurprisingly, they're only 3% up. And that's because they're more bricks and mortar retail, and because they've been closed over the first lockdown and will close again over into our second lockdown in England, they've pivoted online but haven't actually managed to sell more than 3% more. And I've got personal experience of this. They were closed over the Easter period, and I wanted to send some Easter eggs to my niece in London. I thought, great, I'll use Hotel Chocolat. But to get a product was really hard because they'd obviously only had so much selection. A lot was sold out. To get delivery slots was really hard. So, and I think for these businesses, any business that's used to being bricks and mortar and to shift online at pace is really tricky, and we've seen a lot of it. So I'm interested to see if this is a trend that continues into our second lockdown. It definitely will in my house, I have to admit. And the article also says 50% of the UK population have struggled to manage their weight over the pandemic. And this whole push that we've seen talking about trends for 2021, and we're going to eat healthier, we're going to eat more oranges, we're going to eat more vitamin C, we're going to be super healthy. Boris has got his personal trainer, we're all going to shed the weight, and then unsurprisingly we're just all eating massive chocolate bars. What is that something that you see in your household, Rod, and maybe again in some of the companies that you deal with, that you're seeing actually folks are just treating themselves with food that they find comforting?
Yeah. Okay, so two things to say about this. Completely identify with people eating more chocolate in general. I do have to say, but I always I think I like to excuse myself by saying the type of chocolate I like is kind of dark chocolate. So there's kind of some sort of health benefit in there. That's
Nice try.
that's my alibi. But saying that, I think things have got to a point now where even the consumption of dark chocolate is kind of, it's the health versus just overconsumption is balanced on a knife edge. So yeah, I think you do see this with so many foods, don't you? The comfort aspect that surrounds those foods, and on the wider level, we've seen so many reports earlier this year about obesity and the effects of food consumption, particularly in the lockdown scenario where people just aren't getting out and about as much as they did before, and having as much exercise. I, as someone that covers the industry and all aspects of the industry, both the sweet treats and the desserts and the really healthy meals, I always find myself kind of torn on this, really, because I can completely sympathize with people wanting sweet products, be they confectionery, be they desserts, as a treat. And I don't see anything wrong with that. And there is this huge kind of emotional kind of value that comes with that. But again, I suppose that's a little bit worrying, isn't it? Because if there's some sort of emotional, if we're using them as an emotional crutch, then there is an aspect of almost kind of emotional addiction about them, and where they cross the line and go further than just being treats and become kind of just everyday, then there's a real challenge there on the part of the consumer, and a challenge on the part of manufacturers as well. So if you're going to replace those products with healthier products, those healthier products have to have the same emotional impact. And how do you recreate that, both in terms of marketing, but also in terms of the immediate impact of flavor and taste, and the kind of the physical feel of the product in the mouth, all those sort of things that a combination of fat and sugar can do so well. How can we do that in a healthier way? And that's one of the biggest challenges that the food industry faces right now.
Absolutely. And as you say, I think when we are all looking for little bits of comfort, how willing is the consumer as well to stray outside their usual repertoire and try some of these healthier options. I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens with health-focused NPD. Because as you say, on the one hand, you would say, these are very health conscious times. If you are doing something that is health focused, whether it's about an overt benefit or whether it's just a sort of better for you option, you'd think that this is actually a really good time to be talking to consumers about that. But on the other hand, our shopping behavior is sort of, as you said earlier, reverting to those traditional choices, to old favorites, to familiar comforts. I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens with NPD launches in 2021, to see if just how much appetite there is for consumers to not just seek comfort but also be a little bit adventurous. Rod, it's been lovely to have you on. Thank you so much for being our guest.
My pleasure, Julia. My pleasure.
We've loved having you on. Thank you.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.